Give me your take on what's happening with this. We have this interim small business loan deal. We need it. It should be uncapped as far as I'm concerned. There's no reason not to keep putting money out there. We could use tighter controls on it as to who gets it. But your perspective on what's happening with the Democrats. I mean, the bill passed in the House. It's going to be signed today. AOC was the only person who basically said, I'm against it. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, they got nothing in the Senate. They got funding for hospitals. They got funding for testing. That should be pretty bare minimum when we're in a pandemic. And then I understand what you're saying about how the small business program should be uncapped, but we're seeing how it's been abused as well. And the Democrats didn't get any regulations about how maybe we could be a little bit more judicious about what constitutes a small business, aka not Harvard with its $40 billion endowment, aka not Shake Shack, whatever. There was none of that. There was no discussions of that. I understand that there's rumblings about a second payment, but I would have wanted to tie that immediately to this bill. And I think it's great that AOC is standing up against it. I heard all the time in 2016 that if Trump got elected, that the Democrats would become stronger and more progressive and not back down. They're somehow weaker and more pathetic under Donald Trump in the middle of a pandemic, and we have Joe Biden as the nominee. So that theory sucked. But also goes to show how deep and institutional the weakness, the kind of conciliatory attitude towards corporations are, and the inability to effectively fight against Republicans is. That's going to take time. It certainly didn't help that Trump became president, didn't help the progressive movement. I don't think in the substantive way that would have offset the harm that he's done.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, and frankly, I lived through Ronald Reagan and more or less 3 terms of that. George Herbert Walker Bush, in many respects, was an extension of that. And we got Bill Clinton. Lived through, the George Bush Jr. for 8 years and a massive financial crisis. And we got Barack Obama. There was no way we were going to do better than Barack Obama. Look, it was close, but the way that, frankly, and it's not just the Democratic establishment, it's it's people who, the way that they respond to a crisis of a right-wing presidency like this is to basically say, we just want out. And we know, and whatever's going to get us out. And
they cry uncle very quickly. Not Uncle Joe so much, but
exactly. No. And what we're seeing with the Democrats now at best is we're just going to step on the sidelines and let Donald Trump, don't interfere when your enemy is doing themselves a disservice, essentially. But the problem is, on top of that, there is also and Pelosi sort of showed this, and I got a couple of emails of criticizing her earlier in the week for that horrible moment where she was on with her freezer and the ice cream, which I just found just to be the most oblivious. I mean, beyond obliviousness to do that in the context of a pandemic. But first of all, they should be back in Washington. There is no reason why the guy or the girl or the woman who is working Instacart is an essential service and our Congress people are not. That's just not, that doesn't, I'm sorry. We have an absence of leadership in the White House. Our Congress people should be in Congress doing their effing job. They should be doing oversight. They should be trying to figure this shit out so that we don't have to rely on a guy who's literally telling people, like, I'm not saying it's a cure, but I just want everybody to know I came up with the idea. Maybe bleach your lungs.
Yeah. Well, I was on a podcast with Dr. Jason Johnson, and we got into a debate about Biden's visibility and how Biden has not been on television. I obviously think that's some sort of calculated move by his team because he struggles, but also how I think it's really disastrous because the number one thing you need to be right now is visible. And to your point, the Democrats aren't being visible in any way. Oh, Cobra loans. Oh, little tweaks around the edges, and Trump signing checks with his name. And it appears to the layman, to regular people, like Trump's the one cutting checks and the Democrats are nowhere except Andrew Cuomo, who's on TV every day.
Well, there's two different issues. One is the political one, where it's like, yes, you're allowing him to dominate everything. And their theory is, well, if we just lay low, then he's going to have enough rope to hang himself. Maybe that'll work. Maybe it won't. But the Cobra thing is worse than that. That is not just anemic. That is them terrified at the idea of any real structural change coming out of this. And the fact of the matter is that first stimulus bill was a structural change. You know, the Republicans, they don't talk about structural change. They just do it. When they go in and they say, we're going to starve states and we're going to impose austerity and we're going to get rid of all these agencies. It was a structural change when you decided to get rid of the entire pandemic apparatus in the government. That's a structural change. There's a whole host of structural changes that they're imposing. When you decide that we're going to give free license for the Fed to essentially print money for corporations, you're making a structural change in society. You're changing the complete structure of our economy. And the Democrats are so afraid, or just it's just not their political agenda to have any type of structural change, that they will pour good money after bad into Cobra. And remember, this is Nancy Pelosi was talking about PAYGO. She is a Pete Peterson acolyte. The idea that they would go out and burn money by subsidizing Cobra, which is like, if you went into a laboratory and said, what's the most expensive way we could deliver health insurance? This is what you would do. The idea that they're going to go burn that money when it would be much cheaper to expand Medicaid, but they're terrified of that actually being a lasting legacy of this. And they're just as deluded in their own way. Like, there's going to be some changes, and it's either going to be the changes that Mitch McConnell wants or changes that you impose, but there is no middle ground. Things are going to change. It's infuriating. Yeah,
exactly. And if we see around the globe, even before this pandemic, that right-wing populism was winning and the crumbs of neoliberalism were failing, it's part of the trend that they're trying to grasp that kind of marginal centrism, changing things slightly for the better all the time. And it's just not, it doesn't play right now in this current political reality, and it's global. And I think, to your point, it's so much easier politically to justify tearing things down. Oh, this is ineffective. We're going to, do away with it. We're breaking it down. As opposed to being talented enough politically and a big enough thinker and in touch enough with the American people to think of ideas that we could build new things, what's going to play. And that takes a much more talented politician, takes someone who's actually, as I just said, in touch with what Americans want, as opposed to Republicans who bank on people's ignorance of certain programs and are able to just strip things away, fits their agenda, gets rid of necessary tax revenue. So that's part of the burden of being on the left, but we don't have actual leftists making that case. So they're always perpetually losing because they're unable to be politically talented enough to put those programs through.
Yeah, or they don't believe it. I mean, it's one or the other. I mean, it's almost irrelevant.
Well, they're paid also not to believe it.
I think that's true. And this is, I think that's a great point, because essentially what the left is arguing in many instances, and, broadly speaking, is we need to have overcapacity to deal with things in our society. We need to have a certain amount of waste in our health insurance system as a means of which to deal with things as they come up and to provide for people. We
Right.
need to have a certain amount. I mean, and maybe waste is not the right word, but we need overcapacity. When you have a pandemic readiness team sitting on the National Security Council, when you have one at the DHS, when you have people embedded in China from the CDC to look at potential pandemics, on any given year, that could be a waste of money. Like, hey, there's no pandemics this year. We wasted that money. But,
be like Wimbledon. Be like Wimbledon and pay. Did you see that story that they paid $2 million a year for the past 10 years for pandemic insurance, and they got some hundreds of millions of dollars in payout?
I mean, there you go. Right. I mean, but I mean, it's like any other insurance. I've been using this example as like, you don't hear people say, I had fire insurance for the past 15 years. My house didn't catch on fire. It was a total waste of money. And so it is much harder to make the argument that we need these things, even if it isn't self-evident right now. Much harder to make that argument than there's no pandemic. Why do we have a pandemic readiness apparatus? Let's get rid of it. Let's cut it. And we can see, we talk about the numbers in New York of people who have died. It is by far low income, more low income people, more people, brown people, black people, a function of a lot of different things. Ultimately, many of those things can be, either causally or are heavily correlated with with being low income. Yeah. And so the idea is that, the Republicans can make these arguments of we don't need this extra capacity, because when we do need that extra capacity, it is people who are not wealthy who pay the price.
I think it's also a compounding factor too, in why the Republicans are able to get away with it, and why Trump's approval rating is hitting highs in some polls. I know it's dipped over the past few weeks, but the fact that that initial Gallup thing where he had 60% approval for his pandemic response in the media was 44%, 16-point gap. They didn't ask specifically about the parties, but I think, damn, I lost my train of thought. I forget where I was initially going with that.
Well, no, it's compounded by the fact that when Republicans structure things to essentially make low-income people bear the price.
Yes, that was the point I was making. Yes,
and it's compounded by the fact because wealthy people then step in and also continue to push for that agenda. And it's, I don't know. I think as this disease spreads across the country, I think Trump's political fortunes are going to get dimmer and dimmer, frankly. But then there's the other thing of like, this is not going to go away. If Donald Trump loses, this is not going to go away. Donald Trump's not going to go away. But we actually need a legitimate response to this. And so it's one thing for the Democrats to sit there and say, if we're super quiet, maybe no one will know that we're here, and they'll just go out and they'll vote against Donald Trump. And that could be, like I say, an effective political strategy. But the problem is you're not setting up anything to actually respond to these crises. Like time is not on our side with this stuff.
Yeah. There's never a strategy to actually provide an alternate narrative. It's always, as you said earlier, allowing himself to have enough rope to hang himself with it, hoping that he's such a disaster that that's what the American people see too. When, what he's always understood is that it's marketing. And that's my fear about Biden's complete invisibility throughout this.
I mean, I agree. I think it's a dangerous, I think it's a dangerous gamble, but I don't know that there's much of a choice with Biden. Because it's not, even if they said like, you know what, he's going to be really active. He's going to get out there. We're going to put on a mask and he's going to go out there and he's going to deliver food and he's going to be talking broadly about, how we need to address it. That's not on the table. Mm-hmm. I mean, on some level it's like, okay, Biden, for whatever reason, people chose Biden. And he is what he is. I think he could be doing better on, even on his Zoom shows, but there is some internal logic to the idea of like, we're going to lay low. But, just literally, Politico has a piece out today. An academic journal projects that the death of 65 and older Republican voters in several swing states will far exceed those of Democrats. Like literally.
I saw that.
And you know what? I mean, this is, here it is. This is, I don't know what to say. It's horrible. It's a horrible sort of like notion to contemplate that this is, but I'm not terribly surprised. We were saying this when you could watch Sean Hannity for the first 3 or 4 months, like that, or 3 or 4 weeks of this. He's changed his tune, but that mentality is still in the heads of people, particularly in these red states and in swing states of Republican voters. They're still not taking this seriously. They're still, the crisis as far as they're concerned is that, my First Amendment rights are being abridged. I can't go to the Darryl Worley concert.
Yeah, which that's a wonderful reference. Which is why maybe the Republicans, like voter suppression's always worked for them in the past, but perhaps they're just being short-sighted by not including the vote by mail funding that I know Kamala Harris was pushing for and other Democrats were pushing for in this latest bill, because a lot of these older people are going to want to vote by mail. And we saw suppression during a pandemic didn't necessarily work out for them in Wisconsin.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Tables could be turning in that area. It's impossible to predict. Like my instincts, if this were a regular election without the pandemic, I think Trump would win re-election, but I don't know. Who knows? Who knows who will go to the polls? We could see record lows in turnout this time around for many reasons, for both an uninspiring candidate and the inability to vote safely.
Well, it's hard to predict like what the situation is going to be in 3 or 4 weeks, just in terms of like the entire country.
Yeah.
I keep referencing this conversation I had this morning, but he basically said in every pandemic, there is basically one dynamic that seems to be the case, and we don't know why. But the second peak is usually worse than the first, and it usually happens 6 months later, and we don't know why. And so we're talking, if we just peaked in April, we're talking the next peak is in October.
The next peak is in a perfectly terrible spot for the election.
And that's, I guess theoretically that's the New York peak, and we're getting these sort of cascading peaks across. We just don't know.
Yeah.
And, and I imagine you're right about this. The dynamic of the election is completely different with this.